Hello, welcome back. We are picking up in our series. This time we're focusing in on the issue of apologetics. And in the last presentation, I did a little intro to the nature of apologetics. And I told you that I was going to next consider the debate among Christians about the best method of doing apologetics. So by method, we mean here the means or manner of arguing for Christianity. Now, it's critical that we understand, again, the difference between proving and persuading. So here, you'll recognize this slide. The difference has to do with the subjective and the objective. So proving something is objective. You're talking about facts, about evidence, about definitions, about laws of logic. These are all objective considerations. Persuasion's about subjective considerations. It's about the psychology of the person with whom you're arguing, about their emotional condition, their experiences, their biographies. And obviously you want to take that in consideration when you're trying to win people over to a position. But ultimately, you want to win people to a position by means of evidence, by logic, by facts. And that is what the apologetic method debate is really about. Remember, you can persuade without proving, and you can prove without persuading. We want to focus primarily on proving. Now, obviously, we want to do that for the sake of persuading, but we don't want to persuade at the cost of proof. So the debate over apologetic method is really about which method is best to prove the Christian position. Not to persuade, but to prove. Now, again, both of those considerations are important, but I want to really stress that the persuasion issue has to be put secondary. The primary focal point of the debate is on how do you actually construct an argument that is sound, that's cogent, that's compelling. All right, so here you see a chart that says two major methods of proving as it relates to proving Christianity here in apologetic context. The first is sometimes called the traditional method or the common method. It's very, very old. It goes back into early church history and it's continued on up into the present. It is by far and away the most popular method. The second one's called presuppositionalism, and this particular method, which I'll talk about 2 installments from now, is a method that developed in the probably more like the 19th century on into the 20th century, and I'll explain why it's a newcomer on the scene. It has to do with changes that occurred in Western culture. It's a method to try to address those changes. I can't really get into it now. It would just be confusing to try to do that. So I'm going to focus today on the traditional method. And more specifically, today I'm going to zoom in on what are called historical apologetics as opposed to what you might call natural apologetics. If you look here at this particular slide, historical apologetics is focused on trying to prove essentially the person of Jesus Christ as the Messiah, as having been crucified, raised from the dead. And it zooms in on Christianity in particular, on the historicity of the scriptures, both the Old and New Testament. And so it's really focused on God as Redeemer. Natural apologetics is concerned with God as Creator. So you'll recall, I've talked about this a number of times in the series, the difference between the knowledge of God as Creator, the knowledge of God as Redeemer. The knowledge of God as Creator comes from general revelation. The knowledge of God as Redeemer from special revelation. Historical apologetics is focused on special revelation. You see here a book by Josh McDowell. It's a good example of what you might call historical apologetics, also known as evidentialism or the evidential method. You see the book on the right there by Norman Geisler called Christian Apologetics. That would be an example of more natural apologetics, and it's often called the classical method of apologetics. Now, both of these terms are a little bit misleading because, for example, the classical method does use evidence. It's not like it's opposed to evidence. But I think it's fair to say that in terms of the way these words are used now in the discussion, evidentialism tends to refer more to apologetics from historical facts about the life of Christ, about the New Testament in particular. And classical apologetics has more to do with proving the existence of God. Now notice though they're both under the heading of traditional apologetics. And this is because they share something in common. What they share in common is the idea that you're supposed to argue in a non-circular way. You're supposed to argue from evidence or facts that the unbeliever accepts as true and then sort of leverage them from those commonly shared or common ground facts to the conclusion about God as creator or about God as redeemer. That's what they have in common. I'll talk next time about why classical apologetics takes issue with the evidential approach. But today we're going to focus on the historical or evidential approach. I'm going to illustrate it for you today. And the strategy is, first of all, based on this negative axiom. And the prohibition, if you want to think about it this way, is we may not argue from the New Testament as divinely inspired and authoritative scripture. Okay? That would be to assume as true the thing to be proved. You cannot treat the New Testament, according to this strategy, this method, you cannot treat the New Testament as either inspired by God or as authoritative as the Word of God. You have to treat it as a historical document. So we must argue in a linear fashion, okay? A linear fashion from premises that have been established to conclusions based on those premises. We cannot argue in any kind of circular fashion. And so we must argue from evidence that non-Christian scholars would accept as reliable. And notice I said non-Christian scholars. It's not enough to just find any old premise that any old non-Christian would grant to you because, they might be uneducated, they might be uninformed. So we want good evidence, reliable evidence, the sort that scholars would accept. That's the idea. And so we're to treat as factual only what these competent historians would agree to be such. Now, I'm going to further subdivide the historic evidential method into two tactics. One tactic is to demonstrate that the New Testament is a historically reliable document, and then to argue that, therefore, what it says about Jesus is true. Another approach is called the minimal facts approach, and this essentially says that we are to take a minimal set of facts accepted by all or the vast majority of scholars in this field and then reason from them. And three of the facts that often get put forth here would be the fact that Jesus was crucified, that he was buried, that there was an empty tomb perhaps, and that his disciples claimed to have seen him. And then they take those minimal facts and they try to argue that the best explanation for those facts is that Jesus actually rose. Whereas the New Testament, being historically reliable argument, that tries to take the New Testament as a historic document to look at these documents and to show that they have all of the marks of being historically reliable. So let's just accept all that they have to say, including what they say about miracles and about the resurrection of Christ. Okay, so let's try to illustrate this here. I'm going to give you some examples of the kind of evidence that is used in this approach. I'm going to start with non-Christian sources. Here you see a picture of Tacitus. This is considered by some to be Rome's greatest historian. You see his dates there, 55 AD to 120 AD. So 55 AD, that means he was alive when the disciples were still alive. Now, in one of his works, he says this regarding the fire that had occurred under Nero. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Now this is remarkable. This is a Roman historian, no friend of Christians, as you could tell. He calls it a superstition, who is saying, as presumably just a well-established fact, this is not even presented as something controversial here, that there was this man, Christus, who did die the extreme penalty, that's crucifixion, under Pontius Pilate in Judea. So this would be what we call external corroboration of the New Testament. This is called the Pilate Stone. This inscription goes back to 31 AD, and it says on there, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. So this would be another form of external evidence showing the reliability of these claims about Pontius Pilate ruling at this time in this place. Josephus, a Jewish historian, you see his dates there, 37 to 100. That means he was a teen during the early decade of Christianity spreading throughout the Mediterranean. Here is a picture of Jerusalem being besieged by the Romans. Josephus surrendered to the Romans when they had invaded Judea, and he eventually became the court historian to Vespasian, who was the leading general and then eventually the emperor. And he wrote a massive and a very, very thoroughly documented, detailed work on the Jewish wars. In his works, you see some remarkable claims about the family of Jesus, about the disciples, and about Jesus himself. For example, it says, "And now Caesar, upon hearing the death of Festus," this will be in the early 60s, "set Albinus into Judea as procurator. He assembled the Sanhedrin of judges," that's referring to the high council of Jewish leaders, "and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned." So here's referring to James, the brother of Jesus, and obviously referring to Jesus himself. It gets even more explicit. In this passage, he refers to Pilate and to Jesus' death under Pilate. Quote, "At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus." Now that's interesting. He says wise man. That's a way of saying a sage, a rabbi, a teacher. "His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders." Now, some historians have been skeptical of this paragraph because it's such clear attestation to the person of Jesus, to the resurrection, in fact. Now, notice he doesn't actually say that Jesus rose. What he says is that these disciples claimed that Jesus appeared to them after his crucifixion. There's been a lot of scholarly debate about how much of this is reliable. Some scholars say the entire thing is reliable, and it's just begging the question to say otherwise. Others have tried to argue against that. We don't need to get into that debate. But one thing I think is agreed upon by all scholars, that Josephus was attesting to the person of Jesus, to the crucifixion under Pilate. And the one point that might be disputed here is whether the claim about him appearing to his disciples 3 days later is authentic. Okay, let's look at Christian sources now. This slide, which I showed to my students, is really important to understand. When we think of the New Testament, we think of one book, right? The New Testament. We're conditioned to seeing it as one unified source. In fact, though, it's a collection of different writings. And I've tried to put an exploded diagram here before you to give you a sense of how it works. If you look over to the right, you see in the green all of Paul's writings. It's a huge chunk of the New Testament. Now, notice that the red arrow goes from Paul's writings to Luke and Acts. Luke's Gospel and the book of Acts are two writings which went together. I'm going to talk more about them momentarily. But Luke was a disciple of Paul. And so Paul had enormous influence on Luke's own thinking. That's what that arrow is indicating. If you look down to the bottom, you see James and Jude, and they have the red dots next to them. That's to indicate that they were Jesus' brothers. If you look at the yellow dots, that is showing you who were Jesus' disciples. Peter was a disciple, Matthew was a disciple, and John was a disciple. Now, if you look at the red arrow from Peter to Mark, that is showing that Mark was a disciple of Peter. Okay, so we have four Gospels. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew would be a disciple who wrote his own Gospel. And then you would have John, a disciple, writing his own Gospel. But then you would have Mark and Luke, who were not disciples, but who wrote Gospels based on their interaction with the disciples. All right, so when we're thinking about the New Testament as a historic document, what we're really doing is thinking about a collection of different sources, each of which would be arguably historical and reliable. So that means we have multiple attestation going on. It's not just one person writing one book called the New Testament. You've got multiple people writing multiple works, and they are converging, in a sense, on what they're saying regarding the person of Christ. Now, this raises a question, though, that I want to sort of answer up front here. Isn't it a fallacy to rely on biased sources? And the answer is no, it's not actually. We know this from experience, okay? Bias and truth-telling are not incompatible. Think about a victim's family serving as an eyewitness against a murderer, or a police officer testifying on behalf of an accused fellow officer. Or, better yet, think about Holocaust survivors. I used to take my students in Washington, D.C. to the Holocaust Museum, and there's a place there where you can listen to the survivors testify to their experience. Some of them were actually in the concentration centers or even the killing centers and managed to get out. And I asked my students, do you think these survivors were biased against the Nazis? Well, of course, that's a rhetorical question. Absolutely they were. Does that mean we can't accept what they had to say about the Nazis? Well, of course not, right? It's showing you that you can have bias and tell the truth at the same time. In some cases, we know that bias-based skepticism is often defeated by the force of evidence. Think about Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and the early socialists and their narratives about the Industrial Revolution and about all the exploitation that was occurring in the factories. If we were to dismiss those by saying, well, of course you would say that conditions were terrible in the factories, you're a socialist. You know, the obvious response is no, it's completely backwards. They ended up being socialists because of what they saw going on in these cities. Likewise, think about the early abolitionists. They're testifying about the horrors of African slavery. Now, if you were to dismiss their arguments by saying, well, of course you would say that the slave ships are bad, you're an abolitionist, again, the argument is completely upside down. They're abolitionists because of the facts, and so we're accepting their testimony on the basis of their experience on the ships. Well, in a similar way, is it possible that the apostles became biased by the facts? If they had experienced the risen Christ, do you think they would be interested in making that known to people? And if so, then of course they have an agenda. Of course they're going to be about trying to persuade people of him and of his claims. So the fact that you see they have a type of agenda, a type of pro-Jesus bias by itself doesn't prove anything. We have to ask, why did they have that agenda? Why were they so motivated to proclaim the resurrection of Christ? All right, now let's get clear here on this very, very important historic fact, and that is the proximity of the authors to the events. You see here a timeline going from the 20s up into the 90s. Here you have James and Jude. These blue arrows are showing that their lives go all the way back to the life of Christ because they were his brothers. And they go on up into the 60s or so. Then you have Peter, John, and Matthew. These are disciples. They all joined Jesus during his 3-year ministry at the beginning of it. And notice that their lives continue on for decades, John in particular, all the way up into the 90s. Here you have Mark. That's showing you that Mark was a disciple of Peter. So notice the link there, right? Peter is with Jesus for 3 years, and then Mark is with Peter for a long time. And so Mark is a disciple or eyewitness of Jesus himself. There you have Paul, his conversion on the Damascus Road in the 30s, and then you have Luke, who is Paul's disciple. So this is trying to show you that we're not playing the phone game here. We're not talking about people who came, say, 50 or 100 years after Jesus and just started making stuff up. These are people who actually spent time with him. These are eyewitnesses. These are eyewitness documents. All right, so let's think just briefly here, first of all, from about the evidence from Paul. You see his journeys here in this map. The first journey in yellow, the second in purple, and the third in red, the third going to Rome there. And you see the dates, the chronology of his life from his conversion in the 30s on up into his death in Rome in the mid-60s. Now, during this period of time, say 30 years, Paul is writing letters, and we have a huge collection of those letters. Galatians is perhaps the earliest of them, written in 49, maybe 50. And I want to point out some really interesting facts from this epistle. Let me read you a couple paragraphs. He says, "For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers." So he's recounting his history of initially being opposed to the Christians, persecuting them. That would have been in the mid-30s. He continues, "But when he who had set me apart from before I was born and who called me by his grace was pleased to reveal his Son to me," that's a reference to the Damascus Road experience, "in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. But I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. Then after 3 years," so that's late 30s, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas, so that's Peter, and remained with him for 15 days. But I saw none of the other disciples or apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Now, here Paul is saying he went and spent time with the eyewitnesses. So that gives you a link, right? Paul is now, not only did Paul have his own personal experience of Christ miraculously on the Damascus Road, but he is documenting his experience with these initial eyewitnesses in Jerusalem. Now, this is probably the context of what Paul meant in 1 Corinthians. Here is what's called the creed of 1 Corinthians. Many scholars think this is the earliest creed from church history. Paul wrote this letter to the Corinthians in 51 AD. Let me just read this paragraph, and then we'll talk about some of the details. He says, I would remind you, brothers, so he's referring to the Corinthians, of the gospel I preached to you. For I delivered to you as of first importance that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at once, all of whom are still alive, or most of whom are still alive, and so forth and so on. Okay, now, notice what's going on here. When he says, what I delivered to you, okay, what he delivered to the Corinthians was in about 51, in the 50s. And then it says, as of first importance, what I received in Jerusalem. So that's in, say, the late 30s. In other words, he's saying, I was in Jerusalem, I talked to the eyewitnesses, and this is what they were all saying. Namely, Christ died, he was buried, he was raised, and he appeared to numerous people. This is considered the earliest creed because Paul appears to be delivering a creed or confession about historic facts that had been promulgated at the very beginning of church history here in the early to mid 30s. So this puts the death, burial, and resurrection and appearances of Christ very, very early. All right, now the last argument I'm going to make here is from Luke. This is a really powerful historical argument. If you look at this graph here, Luke joins Paul in about chapter 16 of the book of Acts, which he wrote. How do we know this? Well, it's interesting that up until about chapter 16, Luke never refers to himself. And then all of a sudden, in chapter 16, verse 10 onward, he regularly refers to himself as being among the other disciples, Paul, Timothy, so forth. He says, we did this, we did that, we went here, we went there. That means that Luke now is running with them as someone who's interacting personally, and this we'll see is very, very important for appreciating the historic reliability of Luke. Okay, I'm going to give you a number of premises here to build an argument. The first premise is that Luke wrote in the early mid-60s when eyewitnesses were still alive. Well, how do we know this? Luke's narrative in the book of Acts ends with Paul under house arrest in Rome in 60-62 AD. Now, this does not necessarily mean that Luke wrote Acts in 60 to 62. He could have written it earlier. But it does strongly suggest that he would not have written it later. Now, think about this. Luke makes no reference whatsoever to Paul's subsequent years of ministry from, say, 63 to 65 on into his death in Rome. There's no reference to the execution of Peter, James, or Paul, all of which happened by the mid-60s. There's no reference to the Neronian persecution, of Nero's persecution of the Christians in Rome in the mid-60s. And there's no reference to the Jewish revolt and the Roman invasion of Judea, also in, say, the mid-60s. Now, historians think this is a powerful argument from silence. The silence here would be deafening, as they say. If Luke had written this after these events, the idea would be he would surely refer to at least one of them, but he references none of them. Nor does he reference the siege and destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, so premise 2 would be that Luke, who we've now seen wrote no later than the early 60s, maybe even earlier, is a reliable chronicler of the facts. Now there's both internal evidence and external evidence for this claim. Internally, we know that Luke was a physician. And in the Greco-Roman world, a physician, like physicians today, was trained to be very attentive to details, to make critical observations, and to look at evidence and think logically about that evidence. Interestingly, in the beginning of Luke, his gospel, and remember Luke and Acts go together, he says this about himself as a chronicler. He says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses, ministers of the word, have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may have certainty concerning the things you were taught." A couple things here. Notice he references earlier narratives. He says, essentially, he's looking to other sources. So these could be early gospel writings. We don't know what he's referring to, but we know that there are others who are compiling these narratives about the life of Jesus. He also references the fact that he consults eyewitnesses. And he says he's been following this stuff closely, carefully, and for some time. So when a historian of the ancient world looks at various texts from the ancient world, one of the things they're looking for is indicators that the text is meant to be a historically accurate text. That by itself doesn't make it historically accurate, but at least puts it in the category of, okay, giving it the benefit of the doubt, this is claiming to be a historic narrative. And that's what Luke is doing here. So the next question is, does it bear the marks of historicity, of being reliable? I won't read all of this, but this is the account of the famous shipwreck where Paul, en route to Rome, on a Roman ship, is they hit a storm, the ship starts to run aground and so forth. But what's interesting is that Luke recounts the details of this event, virtually none of which, maybe that's too strong, but a lot of these details just aren't necessary to understanding the flow of the book of Acts. It's just gratuitous detail. He says, for example, when the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors suspected they were nearing land, and so they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for the day to come. Notice the detail there, the specificity about the depth of the water, about the number of anchors, and so forth. And if you read this account, it's filled with this kind of detail. It's just not necessary. It's incidental detail. But it's giving you a clue that Luke is concerned about historic accuracy here. All right, argument from external evidence. If you look at the pinkish column here, these are the events. Death of Herod Agrippa I, Sergius Paulus, so forth and so on. Dates to your left. The references to these events in Acts would be in your yellow column. And then external corroboration, that is to say, from outside the New Testament, in your far right column there in the blue. Let's look at some of these. We know from Acts 13 that Paul went to Cyprus and that he converted a very powerful public official named Sergius Paulus, proconsul of the area. And archaeologists discovered this stone here with Sergius's name emblazed upon it. So this would be external corroboration of the existence of this man that is recorded here in Acts 13. Here you have something similar. Now it's referring to Erastus. So in Romans 16, 2 Timothy 4, and in Acts 19, Luke's document, they all reference this man Erastus, the city treasurer of Corinth. And they found this inscription in the city of Corinth that was dedicated to him. Suetonius, another Roman historian, in one of his works references the event in which the Emperor Claudius expelled Jews from Rome. That was in 49 AD, which is a hard date that we can use as sort of an anchor for reconstructing the chronology of Acts. Luke references this same event, but notice the incidental nature of it. He's talking about Priscilla and Aquila here. The narrative is focused on them and their contribution to the advancement of the gospel. But he explains just briefly the reason why they had come is because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So again, you have external confirmation of Luke's accuracy. This is an interesting one. I had the pleasure of being in Corinth and standing right before this where Paul stood. This is the Bema seat where Gallio was considering Paul's case. He had been accused, along with others, of causing problems in Corinth. Now, if you look at the map there, you see Corinth to the bottom part, and then you see Delphi up north of that. Now, in Delphi, which is pretty far removed from Corinth, they found this inscription referring to Gallio, who was in fact the deputy of Achaia. So now you have external, again, confirmation that Gallio was serving this role at that place at that time. Here you see the amphitheater at Ephesus. In Acts, it says that as a result of Paul converting these pagans to Christ, that many of them were getting rid of their idols, and it was cutting in onto the idol manufacturing industry there in Ephesus, and it angered the people responsible for this industry, and so they went after Paul and the others. But notice it says they rushed into the theater. There was a riot in the theater. So it's amazing. We're looking at this theater right here. That's exactly where Paul would have been. All right, and trust me, there are many other facts that we could go through here, but I'm just going to go ahead and end that point here with a quote from Paul Burnett, a New Testament scholar, who is citing Sherman White, who is one of the most renowned scholars in the world on this period of history. In fact, if I remember correctly, he was initially an agnostic who converted to Christianity partly as a result of his studies. The eminent Roman historian A.N. Sherman White has examined incidental references in the Acts to trials, punishment, city government, and citizenship. In case after case, he finds that the narrative agrees with the evidence of the earlier period. In summary, he states about the book of Acts, quote, "Any attempt to reject its basic historicity, even in matters of detail, must now appear absurd." Now, the next premise is that Luke, in this document, which we've shown to be historically reliable, consulted self-proclaimed eyewitnesses of the resurrected Christ. In Acts 21, he says, "After these days, we," there's the we again, referring to Luke and Paul and others, "we got ready and went up to Jerusalem." Notice, now Luke's saying he's going to Jerusalem. "And some of the disciples from Caesarea went with us, bringing us to the house of Manasseh of Cyprus, an early disciple." Now notice that reference, that's referring Manasseh back to the beginning, "with whom we should lodge. When we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. And on the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present." So now Luke is saying, I have had access to James. I have had access to the early disciples there in Jerusalem. And we know, based on what Luke said earlier, that he would have been asking them questions, trying to collect as much information as he could to reconstruct his biography of the early church. The next premise is that Luke records the earliest preaching of the resurrection in Jerusalem immediately after the crucifixion. Let me just say that again. Think carefully about this. This is a really, really critical premise. Luke is recording the earliest preaching that we have of these eyewitnesses, okay? And what he's saying is these self-proclaimed eyewitnesses were preaching the resurrection in Jerusalem. This is ground zero, okay? This is where it all happened. Immediately after the crucifixion. This is very, very important. Before I explain why, consider this. Here is a passage from Acts, and it says that they were preaching it in the portico of called Solomon's portico, and you see the arrow pointing to it. So picture this. You have Peter and the others who were with Jesus for 3 years and who saw him die on the cross under Pontius Pilate, and they're now right in the portico of Solomon proclaiming that they have seen him alive. We have seen him, touched him, heard him. Look at these texts here. And on the basis of this, they're calling out on the Jews to repent and to turn to Jesus as their Messiah. Now, why is this important that Luke has recorded for us these earliest messages of the eyewitnesses in Jerusalem immediately after the crucifixion? Well, it's because of this. If you're going to make something up that can be falsified, if this is false and it can be falsified, you're not going to proclaim this message at ground zero in Jerusalem immediately after the crucifixion of this man Jesus. You're going to go way out to the outer edges of the provinces of the empire, and you're going to go to gullible pagans, and you're going to tell them some false message which they could believe and could not falsify. You're not going to say this sort of thing to the original audience who just recently watched this man die on a cross. And this leads to the ultimate conclusion, which is, why were they doing this? Why were these men identifying as eyewitnesses of a resurrected criminal, someone who had died the worst possible criminal death on a cross, with the support of the Sanhedrin, the support of the Jewish leadership? Why are they saying this there at that time? You have three options. They were deceivers. They were lying through their teeth. They knew that he hadn't risen, and they just wanted people to believe that he had. Or they themselves were deceived. Somehow they hallucinated that they saw Jesus, something to that effect. Or they were telling the truth. Those are your three options. But what the historic evidential apologetic is saying here is the fact that has to be explained is that these men were calling themselves eyewitnesses of a resurrected Jesus in Jerusalem immediately after the crucifixion. That is a historic bedrock fact that has to be explained. And so the historic evidentialist is going to say, you've got three options. They were deceivers, they were deceived, or they were telling the truth. Now, in my class, we go into great detail looking at these first two options, the deceiver hypothesis and the deceived hypothesis. We won't do that today, but that gives you an illustration of the kind of argument that a historic evidentialist would use. Next week, when we meet again, I'll talk about classical apologetics, and I'll explain why a classical apologist would actually take a little bit of issue with the argument that I just gave you today, and how they'd want to modify it and strengthen it using what they call the classical method. And then the following week, we'll look at presuppositional apologetics, which takes issue with both of these methods, and we'll see why then. So thanks for joining me, and until next time, I hope you have a great week. Thanks.